Hello. On behalf of Barnard College and Women in Hollywood, it is my honor to welcome you to the 11th Annual Athena Film Festival. This festival is dedicated to celebrating the stories of bold, courageous women leaders and the filmmakers who bring these stories to life. Thank you for joining us. My name is Melissa Silverstein, and I am the Artistic Director and co-founder of the festival. I am also the founder and publisher of Women and Hollywood. This year's festival would not be possible without the support of our dedicated sponsors. Please join me in thanking Athena's founding sponsor, the Artemis Rising Foundation, and its CEO, Regina K. Scully, whose visionary leadership makes our work possible. A special thank you as well to our premier level sponsor, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which shares our commitment to showcasing stories of women in science. To all of our sponsors, whose names you will see before each film and event, thank you for your commitment to challenging our culture to be more inclusive and inspiring audiences in the process. Very excited for this panel. I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for the panel, How Women Athletes Are Leading the Way on Gender Equality and Racial Justice, Barnard College President Sian Bilak. Sian came to Barnard in July 2017 after spending 12 years at the University of Chicago, both as a professor and as executive vice provost. She is one of the world's leading experts on the cognitive science behind choking under pressure and performance anxiety, with a focus on math and science for women and girls. She is the author of 2 books, the critically acclaimed Choke and How the Body Knows Its Mind. And her 2018 TED Talk has been viewed over 2 million times. And I happen to know, I think that she played goalie, right? Back in the day. So she's a perfect person to be moderating this panel. Hi, Sian. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, hi, Melissa. This is so exciting. And, you know, I'm an athlete myself and a big fan of women athletics. And I'm so excited to have this conversation today.
Well, enjoy.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here to really lead a conversation about leading both on and off the field. And we have some fantastic panelists today. Our first panelist is Kavitha Davidson, who is the Webby-winning host of The Lead. And it's the daily national podcast of The Athletic. Kavitha was previously a weekly columnist and a feature writer for ESPNW and ESPN The Magazine. And before that, she wrote daily sports column for Bloomberg with a heavy focus on the intersection of sports, business, race, gender, and culture. I think what we're going to be talking about today. Her work has covered such wide-ranging topics as equal pay, athletic protests, violence against women, stadium subsidies, sports tax law, and labor dynamics. Her first book on sports fandom, written with Jessica Luther, was published in September 2020. Kavitha, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I have to say it's a thrill for me to be here. I actually started my college career at Barnard, and my sister is a proud Barnard alum, and I was the sports editor of the Columbia Spectator, so it feels like coming home a little bit.
Oh, fantastic. It's so great to have you as part of the Barnard family. Now you all are part of the Barnard family. Our second guest is Lindsay Gibbs. She's a sports reporter with a focus on gender in sports, and she co-hosts the feminist sports podcast, Burn It All Down, and is the author and founder of Power Plays. I love this, a no BS newsletter about sexism in sports, the number 3 ranked sports letter on Subtrack. She is currently writing a book for Beacon Press about the current wave of activism in women's sports. And so I'm so excited to have her here today. And our third panelist is Megan McPeak. Megan, in October 2018, became the first female play-by-play broadcaster in 30 years to call an NBA game, which featured the Washington Wizards take on the Detroit Pistons. Megan, who won?
Oh, wow. I really should know that.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. You could think about it. She also announced the play-by-play broadcaster, was announced as the play-by-play broadcaster for the Capital City Go-Go, the G League affiliate for the Washington Wizards, as they embarked on their inaugural season. And in the 2019 WNBA season, the Washington Mystics announced Megan that she would join the broadcast play-by-play alongside Christy Winter-Scott. And Megan is also part of the Bring It In with Morgan Campbell on CBS Sports. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. So I wanted to start with really a broad question, which I think, is on all of our minds and something that we've been seeing a lot of as of late. Women have always, I think, been on the forefront of the fight for gender equity and equality around pay issues in sports. And a lot of this, I believe, has strong roots in teams in the US, but we're seeing so much of this globally now as well. I'd love to hear from all of you about what you think this impact of activism is on the growth of different sports, and how this has changed from maybe something that was focused primarily, or was it focused primarily in the US, to something that now is much broader. Maybe we can start with you, Megan.
Yes, Sion, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to Barnard College and the Athena Film Festival for hosting this panel and a discussion that I think is so very important. And I'm really happy to be alongside friend and colleague Lindsay, and I'm so excited to finally get to do something and meet Kavitha. So I'm really excited to be here amongst all of you ladies. And I think when you look at women athletes and activism in sports, you typically see the conversation start with what the men are doing. And I think this summer has been a very great example of that. A lot of people have been giving credit as it's due. The credit is due to the Milwaukee Bucks and the NBA in what they did in that decision to, at the time, essentially boycott. And then we've now heard the verbiage being used as having games postponed while they were in the NBA restart in the bubble. And that was a decision that, had ripple effects. It started with the NBA, and it then went on to the WNBA with the Mystics making the decision that they were going to sit out their game. And that game had playoff implications in both situations when you think of it. And then we saw the ripple effect. It then went on to, soccer, Major League Baseball. And what I was very surprised about, but also not surprised because they were essentially pressured into it, was the NHL also having their voices be heard as well too. But what I want people to realize is female athletes have been at the forefront of this conversation in the last few years, going 5 to 7 years back. Female athletes have consistently been utilizing their voices and their platforms. And a lot of people say, well, their platform isn't that big. If you have a voice and you can use your voice, you have a platform. Whether you are on social media and you have 200 followers or 200,000 or 2 million, you have a platform. The four of us have a platform. We're utilizing it right now with this conversation. So I think when it comes to female athletes and the activism across all leagues, it's been consistent. And that's the biggest thing. And in my opinion, when it comes to activism, whether it's pay equity, sex equity, racial equity, consistency is the biggest part of the program and the biggest part of the pie that I think needs to be remembered, because you can, have that moment and say something, but what are you doing afterwards? What's the fallout? What is your plan now? And I think this summer we saw the example of that with, this is what we're doing. We're utilizing our strength and our power, and we're going to make something happen. And we saw that from both the W and the NBA after the return to play began, after the 3 days off, with what their plan was moving forward and how they were going to utilize what they can and their voices to help the community going forward.
That's great. And I love all of the examples of the activism that's played out primarily as we're talking about US-based teams. I know some in Canada as well. Lindsay, what's happening in the US versus around the world? Was the US here the leader with women's soccer, with others, or has this been happening in other places and we're just now hearing more about it?
I think that female athletes, women in sports, are inherently activist. The very fight to get onto the field, to get funding from their nations, to get support. And of course, from country to country, the degree of these fights vary. But I don't think it's fair to say like this all started in the United States, right? Like we have, there's a team in Afghanistan that has been, been working and been finding for over a decade now, finding anywhere they could to play. That's a form of activism right there. In Spain, the same thing. And you had them at the 2015 World Cup really come out and you finally use their platform to speak out against their coach and to speak out against the misogyny they've been experiencing. So I think what you're seeing is the stakes rising a little bit as women's sports become more ingrained into kind of the fabric of society as the platform grows. Some of them, not all of them, are now able to push that fight further, right? The platforms are, with the U.S. women's soccer team, right? Like they've, they're still fighting for equality, right? But they're there. And so they're really now pushing the conversation forward. And it's, of course, I think it's a ripple effect. I think it matters that the best team, the winningest team in the world is having these fights. And I think there is a trickle down effect. But I also think that it's definitely not the proper lens to say that this is that only people in other women in other countries are only fighting because of, the American athletes are fighting. That is not at all true. And I think around the globe, the activism that's happening on the ground and we say the stakes are higher when the platform is bigger, but honestly, when it's smaller, the stakes are higher, right? Because you have to go through so many barriers just to be able to get on the field. What was it? I think I was watching Brazil versus Argentina in the She Believes Cup yesterday. Argentina, because of COVID, didn't even have a single, didn't even convene once the entire year, their national team, right? And all of a sudden are under this spotlight. So I just think that the fights look a little bit different out everywhere, but I think activism is ingrained into the fabric of women's sports.
I love this idea that all women who are competing and voicing their right to compete and to play are activists to a certain extent. And I think we sometimes forget when the attention is on one team or one issue that, as Megan said, this is something that's been consistent across women's sports and across all different sports. Kavitha, tell us what you're thinking lately about what we're seeing in the last few years, about the rise in interest in women's sports. How do we continue that? Where are we going?
Well, I think the interesting thing to examine on a global level is how much support there is from especially the government side in different countries. The UK has an entire part of their parliamentary body that is just for sports. They have a minister of sport who is a member of parliament. That's not something that we have in the US. Cory Booker has actually tried to make it part of his platform to bring that here. But the minister of sport in the UK said a few years ago that it is a civic duty to give women equal airtime, to give women's sports equal airtime on TV. It is a civic duty to have equal opportunities for women who want to play sport. The UN has long declared access to sport as a human right. And this goes back to, London 2012, the Olympic Games that were held there was the first year that basically every country, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Brunei, were forced to send a woman. It was the first year that every country had to have equal representation. And that legacy has persisted in some ways. I do think it's interesting when we talk about the activism factor. I think Lindsay is absolutely right. The sheer act of being a woman who plays sports is a radical act. So there's something about that lends itself to being involved in activism, whether it's pay equity, whether it's social justice. Megan is also absolutely right. I think all three of us have, whenever we're asked about athlete activism and the questions start with LeBron or Colin Kaepernick, all power to those guys. We are like, Serena was there tweeting before LeBron was. The Minnesota Lynx were protesting in 2017 before anyone noticed that Colin Kaepernick was kneeling during the anthem. And these women never really get their due. And I think, both Megan and Lindsay said this. Part of it is because the platform is assumed to be smaller, which in many ways it obviously is. We're very realistic about that. But as Lindsay said, that also means they're taking more risk. We're talking about, a WNBA that in 2017 especially was pre-CBA renegotiations, pre-salary adjustments, all of that. These are not women who had nest eggs to rely on if they got canceled, so to speak, for speaking up about these things. the bravery that it takes to be able to do this, still very much in line with just the bravery it takes to play sports in general, can't be overstated. And I think that the global impact of this, I mean, I agree with Lindsay that it's probably a little bit jingoistic to say that, you know, the American fight for equality is what's inspired people around the world. I do think there's absolutely some of that there. I think when you see a women's soccer team take a equal pay fight to the Supreme Court, that does obviously have some ripple effects. But I would go back to Venus Williams, frankly. On a global scale, Venus Williams with Billie Jean King achieved pay equality for all prize money in Grand Slam tournaments. That's an international tournament. That was really kind of the first modern day example that we could see of women achieving this thing that we have been trying to fight for, frankly, even outside of sports for decades, right? And so I do think that there's a lot there. Lindsay brought up watching Brazil, Argentina. The fact that it was the American women who kind of maybe on the soccer side started this conversation because of how much power they have, because they're mostly white, frankly, because they garner the ratings that they do. But we still haven't been able to achieve that. Brazil, starting with Marta, who, you know, in the last Women's World Cup, took the mic and talked about this next generation of Brazilian women stars who do not have anywhere near the infrastructure or support that the American women do, and that they have achieved pay equity is really a remarkable accomplishment to see.
It's so fantastic to hear you all speak about this and even think back. Like it is really important to push back to those women who didn't get the stage or the attention that women and men, frankly, today are getting. I mean, speaking of that, we know that a majority of the sports media coverage still is focused on male sports and men athletes. How do we change that? Megan, what should we be doing to work on changing that? What are the steps? What are you guys all doing?
Well, I think what Lindsay is doing is one step, and that's, you know, people focusing specifically on the women's game, whether it's soccer, basketball, softball, fast pitch, hockey, it doesn't matter. You need to have people who are going to dedicate their profession to following and covering these female athletes. And, you know, I want to try and stop saying female athletes. They're athletes, point blank, period. Doesn't matter their gender. I could care less. So, like, let's talk about Serena's husband's t-shirt. He had the female crossed off while watching her at the Australian Open, and it just said greatest athlete. He made a statement with that t-shirt, and he's not wrong. These are athletes, period. And I think when it comes to coverage, if I'm not mistaken, Lindsay, Kavitha, please correct me if I'm wrong, but women's coverage in sports is under 6% still, not even in double digits when it comes to the landscape of sports media and covering women's athletics. So
I have
the fact
4%
that
written down. So you're very close.
See, even worse. I was being generous. Look at me here. But when you think of that, like 4%, that means 96% of the coverage is dedicated to the men's side. And I could right now flip on my TV, and I guarantee you it will probably be football or NBA being talked about, neither which have anything to do with women's athletics. So the fact that you have nationally televised shows that are not giving a lot of time to the female athletics, that's an issue too. But what they're going to do is they'll have a female athlete come on and talk about the men's game. That's them giving shine to the women's game, having a female athlete come on to talk about the men's game. Why not have her come on to talk about the women's game? Do both. I don't understand why you can't do both. If she can't talk about the women's game because she's part of the league still, then guess what? Find someone who can. Lindsay and Kavitha are sitting right here. Two of them can talk about soccer and basketball, no problem. Can talk about tennis, no problem. You need to find the people who know the game to talk about the game and be willing to have those people on television and in the media covering these things. So when we want to see more women covering sports, that's fantastic because there's a change there. But now we need to see more men and women covering both men's and women's sports. And that's going to be where some of the change comes from. But I think the first step is exactly what, you know, Lindsay and Kavitha are doing, is focusing on covering a lot of the women's sports as well too.
Lindsay, tell us a little bit about where your podcast came from and how that came about and what you're doing to push away from this 4%, which is frankly, a dismal number. Oh, I think you're on mute. The classic Zoom comment.
Oh, sigh. You'd think 11 months into this, I would know, but nope. I actually think you were talking about that 4% number. When you look at advertising and sponsorship dollars, I think that's 1%. It's the last big study, 1%. So the numbers are dismal. And, it comes back to investment and accountability. These are the two things, and collective action. So three things that I think are the only way forward. But from the media side, the podcast started. I had been a freelancer in the sports writing world for a while, and then I moved to work at a site called Think Progress, where I was the lone sports reporter in a political newsroom. So it was a very kind of unique situation, especially during the Trump years, right? To be kind of covering sports through this lens on a full-time basis. But one of the things that I was really lucky to have access to was the women's sports, because I was in DC and I could go to the Mystics games and I could go to the Washington Spirit games, right? And I could get honestly like a front row seat to, the best women's sports in the world. And that was a really big benefit. So we started, with my editor, I started to say, let's hold each other accountable. Like, it's going to be so easy to just write about every single issue through the lens of LeBron or, you know what I mean? Or what's going on the men's side. Like, I could cover politics and sports that way, but let's make sure that we are covering the big picture from the women's side, at least equal. I did that so much that I became incredibly invested in that bigger picture on the women's side. So the podcast came through, it's been about 4 years now. It came through a group of women who work in sports media or sports academia, sports historians. And we all kind of found each other in a DM group, right? This is another problem, is the harassment, honestly, that women in sports face and women in sports media. And a lot of us were covering issues of sexual assault and domestic violence and receiving a lot of abuse from that. And so we became a support group through a Twitter thread and ended up being like, we should really start our own podcast. We did. It's been, we just recently partnered with Blue Wire. So every single week, there's 5 co-hosts. Usually about 3 of us get together every single week and come together and just talk about the biggest sports stories of the week or the month, kind of what's going on. And, if you look through the sports podcasting page on iTunes, it is like, I remember one time I looked at it and I saw 3 women in the top 100 and they weren't even their own shows. It was just like they were the co-host. Sometimes they were just the moderator of these conversations. So we just think it's really important that we have, carved out this space. Now, my newsletter, Power Play, so Think Progress, I was there for 4 years and it got shut down. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted my next step to be, because I loved covering women's sports from this, from a big picture angle. And I wanted to find a way to continue to do that. And so I ended up starting my own publication called Power Plays. And it exclusively writes about kind of the power structures within women's sports. And of course, that includes racism and transphobia and investment. We have an entire series called Covering the Coverage, where we literally look at newspapers and count the number of women's sports stories they cover and tally them up and put them and put those numbers out there on a regular basis. And stuff like that, I think, is so important, because the amount of people if you can get past the defensiveness, right? Well, this is why we made this one decision on a small level, right? Which I have plenty of editors coming into, my DMs doing and defending their decisions. But when you point out to them that it's day after day after day after day, and the way these decisions compound marginalization, I think it empowers people to not change everything at once, right? Not go back to 50% once, but what if we can get to 10% in the next, by the end of the year? And then what if we can get to 20% next year? And that's how we grow bit by bit.
Fantastic. So we're pleased to have a special guest with us tonight, Ada Hegerberg, who is a Norwegian international professional football player. She played for the Norwegian national team from 2011 to 2017 and became a global phenomenon with her current Olympic team, Olympic Lyonnais, winning 6 league titles, 5 cups, and 5 UEFA Championship League trophies. She was crowned the UEFA Player of the Year in 2016 at age 21. I'm aging you. But really young, and was named BBC Best Footballer of the Year in 2017 and 2019. Norwegian Player of the Year in 2015, 16, and 18, and was more notably named the Ballon d'Or in 2018, becoming the first woman ever to win the trophy at age 23. This is just an incredible stat. I had my 9-year-old do this math the other day. She scored 282 goals in 272 games in her club career. Ada, welcome. It's so wonderful to have you here.
A pleasure to be here as well. I feel like every time I'm hooking up with some American kick-ass women, I also get some pump and boost out of it, because I think that you guys are very focused on feminism in a good way, and I like that. So it's a pleasure to be here as well.
Well, I think we're going to get some pump and boost out of you too. So the feeling is mutual. I hope everyone, I think it's always a great time when people's bios are read to reflect on yourself and realize how amazing you've all been. I think we often, I think this is a trend among women, but in general, we downplay our successes. And so it's good to embrace them, right? To remember everything you've done. And as a psychologist, I often tell people, just go read your CV every once in a while, your resume. It's okay to feel good about what you've done. So anyway, I hope you're feeling good about everything you've done. And all of you are so impressive. We were just talking about how to really change the coverage of women's sports in the media. I had thrown out a 4% number, that only 4% of women's sports or sports coverage is focused on female athletes, or athletes in general, as Megan had talked about. And Lindsay had corrected me, saying it's even less when we put in advertising and commercials. And I think Kavitha, who's written a book on sports fandom, has some ideas perhaps about how to change that. Kavitha, do you want to address this issue?
Well, yeah, I mean, as we've talked about, I started my sports writing career at Bloomberg. So I have always, and I'm a sports business reporter by trade. So I've always, tried to make the financial argument for things that I believe. Obviously, I think that women's sports should have equal representation and equal coverage. I think there is a moral argument there. I think that women's sports in general, is a human right, but you're just not going to convince people who are making the decisions that matter that just because something is the right thing to do, it is the thing they should do. So you have to make the tangible financial argument. I've been trying to do that for years. The problem has always been that sports media and sports marketing are industries built on inertia. Men's sports in particular are assumed to be perpetual motion machines. We just saw a year where everyone's finances throughout sports were called into question because of COVID. And the NFL, we were assuming that the NFL salary cap would have to drastically reduce because of reduced revenues, and it actually increased by $5 million. So, we've seen that what that really goes to show you is that there's long been a attitude by the men who are mostly making the programming and marketing decisions that men's sports will continue to make money no matter what happens. Women's sports are too much of a financial risk to take. what we have seen in the last couple of years, we have seen ESPN air a lot more WNBA games, and frankly air them in prime time instead of at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, at times when people will actually tune in to watch sports. We have seen more brands sign on, big name brands, P&G and Secret, and sign on to women's leagues, mainstream sports brands that have long been in this space, because they are seeing what some of us have been telling them for years, if not decades, that you are leaving money on the table if you are not giving women's sports equal play, essentially. Now, that is an attitude. I did an internship. I was an analyst at Nielsen Sports before I moved into the journalism space. And I remember meeting with advertisers at, I'm not going to call them out here necessarily, but big name, let's say, these same companies now, almost 10 years later, are investing in marketing in women's sports. 10 years ago, I would go to them with data, hard data that we had about women's viewing habits of sports, of both men's and women's sports, women's consumer habits. Even if you assume that women aren't watching sports, women are still buying the beer. They really are. So it matters who you're marketing to. And it has taken 10 years for that kind of a message really to take hold. But you've seen that shift, right? You see a lot more women getting marketing deals. You have WNBA players who finally have deals with Nike and Adidas. Now, we are still waiting for a WNBA player to have her own shoe, and I think that will be a major lift in this space. But it's about making the financial argument to the people who are making the decisions, who have always assumed that it's not worth the investment. But the thing is, it's a chicken or the egg situation. If you don't invest in the marketing, if you don't make smart decisions about when you're airing these games, if you don't make smart decisions about the platform on which you're airing these games, right? I mean, everybody is canceling cable right now and moving to streaming services. So there needs to be more investment on that end. And we saw, the NWSL do bonkers numbers on CBS All Access this summer. When you actually have a little bit of faith, then you see the return on your investment, and then you put more money into it. And that's really what, leagues like the NWSL, like the WNBA, who, are now, the WNBA is, these are leagues that are now led by people who have financial backgrounds from like Deloitte, who can make these arguments to investors about why their sport is valuable. That's really when you're going to start seeing the needle move. And I think we're seeing that begin already.
So we are seeing, I think it's great to hear that we are seeing the needle move, and the financial argument seems pretty clear to me. It's half the population that you can also that you're missing here. Maybe this question is for Ada. I mean, given the increased popularity, especially of women's soccer, and more young girls playing, I would argue that more dads are paying attention likely. Why is it still so difficult to push national teams and others to invest in what's happening in women?
I think Kavita has all the points right, to be honest. If we can almost compare it to how can you break the stigmas, first of all, but also how can you give everyone the same opportunities from day one. I always try to think about how we as women players, how can we always improve the product, how can we train even smarter. But it all comes down basically to give the young girls starting at 6 years old the same opportunities as we do with the guys and the young boys. And I think that if you start taking these girls very seriously from day one, I always mention a phrase, and that is, if you start to teach a girl how to play a pass when she's 6 years old rather than when she's 20, it says itself that the product's going to be much, much better in the end as well. So it is truly about giving opportunities from day one in order to let these girls try to take their chance to become pros. And I think that if you compare it to the financial part of it, like you mentioned, Kavita, is that have we ever been given the chance to be invested in? I think you got to start at some point, right? And I think that's the same with the product as well. How can you increase the quality? In my eyes, it's all about giving opportunities from day one and start to take girls seriously. And obviously, it starts by the parents as well, changing the stigmas. My parents, I was very lucky to have parents who always told me to believe in myself, to follow my own way. No barriers, being a girl, and that has been a game changer for me.
I love that. And actually, there's some great psychology research showing that whether dads hold gender stereotypes predicts how successful girls will be in sports, and thinking they can do math at a high level. And it's the idea that, you know, it's not just moms who are pushing the girls. It's really oftentimes how the everyone in a child's life is perceiving the opportunity, right, with no barriers. Ada, you played on the boys team early on, right? And that was a big part of this. I wonder if anyone has thoughts about how we even think about putting and putting together sports teams early on for young girls. You know, I think there's oftentimes this push to have boys and girls play separately, especially from young ages. And I'm wondering if what you all think as panelists, anyone here, about whether we should change that.
I really love the idea by combining young girls and boys in teams from day one. I think there's a physical difference from early on, but obviously it increases with the age. But where I grew up, we had mixed teams, and it was a great thing. I think at that point, it's a very good thing for both young girls and young boys. And at some part, obviously, you have to take the decision rather if you want to stay with the boys or if you want to be included in a girls team. I took the decision to stay with the boys. First of all, because they were my friends as well, but also because I felt that the environment being in a boys team was completely different rather than being in a girls team. I felt that you could express yourself in a completely different manner. You were allowed to be pissed if you lost. There were screaming at trainings, basically completely different from the girls' environment. And it's a funny story because I've been every time I'm back home training in Norway, I'm at a pitch, and I often watch how the girls' sessions are organized compared to the boys' sessions. And sometimes I just want to drag my hair because I get so frustrated. I mean, you see young girls spending 30 minutes on playing around, joking around, trying to get the cones and the goals in place. And when you see the boys, everything is organized from minute one. And I really think that young girls also want to be taken seriously. And we also have to put demands to young girls for them to be taken seriously as well. So there's a lot of things to change, I think, in how you organize and how you look at young girls playing football at a young age. You need to put demands, you need to take them seriously and put them in a so-called organization, and also let them express themselves. Yes. Let girls be pissed by losing. I think that's a very important thing.
I love that.
It seems like, sorry, Simon.
Go on.
It seems like even though we grew up in different countries, it seems like Ada and I had very similar upbringings. I grew up with an older brother, so I wanted to do everything he did, which meant if I wanted to play, I had to play with him and his friends. So I was playing with my brother's friends who were 4 and 5 years older than me from a young age. So I'm, 6 playing with, 10 and 11-year-old boys. And my brother's rule was to my mom, if she's going to play with us, she can't cry. The minute she cries, she's going back inside. And that was the rule. And I learned very quickly that I could not cry, because the first couple of times that, I got pushed to the ground, and we had, where we lived in, on a court. So we had the house that was in the nice rounded area. So we could put 2 hoops up on the asphalt and just go back and forth. And I learned very quickly after falling twice that if I'm going to cry, I can't play anymore. So my brother would put me in timeout, and I'd have to go back in and, pick myself back up and come back out. And I learned quickly that you can't you can't accept being pushed around. And if you are, you just push back. And I think it's so interesting that boys are taught not to allow each other to get pushed around, but girls are not allowed that same situation. Whereas, I also grew up playing in, travel basketball and AAU basketball with a coach who had that mindset. He was a professional football player. He happened to have 2 daughters and a son, and he treated them all the same, which meant he treated his entire girls basketball team all the same. So we heard 4-letter words at practices. If the parents didn't like it, he told them that parents could get the 4-letter word out. He was going to run his practice the way he saw fit. You had 2 options: deal with it, or I'll give you your money back and you can leave and find another program. And we dealt with it, and we learned how to, fend for ourselves, how to have not how to have a backbone, but how to stick up for ourselves and not back down. And that, for myself at least, it gave me a confidence that I could go toe to toe with guys when it came to, the playground at school. If they thought they were better than me, I would say, okay, check up, let's go, prove it. And I think, even to Ada's point of the way that you see, some girls programs run versus some boys programs, it's like practice is 60 minutes and you may see some girls take, 25, 30 minutes just to get organized, but it's not because the kids don't want to get organized. It's sometimes the parents are chit-chatting with the coach and taking up the time, or the coach isn't really, into it. And it's just like, what's going on? But yet you can look down on the other side of the field and see a group of boys and they've been practicing for 30 minutes already. So I think up until the age of, 11, 12, 13, when on average, typically, kids go through puberty, that's where I think we could still see boys and girls playing together. And if parents want to remove their children earlier than that, that's totally fine, personal preference. But I think there should be programs that you can play mixed gender together, because I think it's great for both genders to be playing with the opposite gender. Because you see on social media now too, you'll see little girls going viral for crossing up boys who are twice their size on the football field. And by football, I mean soccer, original footy. Kids who are getting crossed over by girls on the basketball court, and she might be like 7 years old and she's playing against a bunch of 13-year-olds. Like, it's clearly possible for kids to play together. We do it at school on the playground at recess. Why can't we do it in organized sports?
Yeah, we do it in families. And I think, this goes back to what Kavitha was saying and Ada was saying about giving opportunities and holding high expectations. And it's interesting. I think it sounds like we all have similar stories. I have my memory of being in 3rd grade and wanting to play on the boys team. And my mom was told no. And my mom, who happened to be a lawyer, said, this is illegal. And she screamed. And it was when I realized that rules could be broken, that you could push on them. And so I played with the boys till I was 12. And, I was all the better for those high expectations and that we should be giving to both. So we don't have so much time left. So I wanted to throw out one question to all of you. I think this is such an important moment in time where we're starting to see momentum and shift in terms of women being given more attention on the playing field, on the court, sponsors, all of the financials that Kavitha is talking about, and I know she talks about in her book as being important here. What's next? What is next? What if you could name a single most important thing to focus on in the next phase or the fight for equality in women's sports? What would it be? Lindsay, what would it be?
Big investment and big goals, I think, for me. There's a story about Cricket Australia, which I don't know much about cricket, so it's weird for me to bring up cricket, but this is one of my favorite recent stories. They held the Cricket Women's World Cup, T20 World Cup, this time last year. And they decided, first of all, in 2015 that they were going to start a league that was going to be the premier destination for women's cricket. So they launched the Women's Big Bash League. So they started to create infrastructure. In 2016, they were awarded the men's and women's T20 World Cup. Before, those had always been held together. They decided to separate them because they said the only way the women's will get proper investment is if we treat it as a standalone entity and we put it in prime time, we put it in stadiums it can fill, and instead of it being an afterthought to the men's, we'll make it premier. And then in 2017, they decided after the 2016 World Cup was such a success in England, and it broke an attendance record that was about 26,000. They decided they were going to try and fill the largest cricket grounds in the world, which was the, sorry, I'm looking for the name of it. My Aussie friends are going to kill me. But the Melbourne Cricket Grounds, which seats up to like 100,000 people. And their goal was to break the world record for attendance at a women's game, a women's match that was set in 1999 at the Women's World Cup here in the US. And they explicitly set out to do this on Women's History Day. And they stated the goal out loud 3 years ahead of time so that they had to put in the investment to make it worth it, right? Like they're literally like the organizer said, if not now, when? If not here, where? They knew that this was a chance and that if they put the right amount of organization into it, they could break records, and they did. They had more than 90,000 people at this match, which is just remarkable. And so I think like we need more thinking like that. We need more bold thinking like that. We have to stop being afraid of what happens if women's sports succeed, because I think that's often what this is. I think you have men at the top who aren't afraid of them failing. They're afraid of them maybe becoming bigger than the men, and they like keeping them down. Like we need to, give them the opportunity to be successful beyond our wildest dreams, and it will happen.
Kavitha, what is the next phase in your mind?
Well, I agree with investment. Again, like just looking at everything from a business angle, right? We're talking about major industries here. Brands matter. They really do. We saw this in the US with social justice and activism, right? Like the NFL only got on board when they started getting pushback from the brands and from major sponsors. Washington, Dan Snyder didn't change the name of the Washington football team because he suddenly realized he suddenly had a come to Jesus moment. Pepsi gave him a call and Nike gave him a call. So I think that brands moving the needle on women's sports, both from an infrastructure perspective, because there's obviously just a money situation that needs to be handled, but also from a perception situation. And, to your point about dads, dads making a huge difference here. I think that we are seeing a huge generational shift just culturally, especially in the United States, but elsewhere, about the next generation, like our generation who are now becoming parents, which is weird and freaking me out a little bit, but raising the next generation of boys and girls to see less of this artificial gender divide, right? And to understand that you can play together. Obviously, at some age, at puberty, wherever that is, there are physical differences that kick in. But the first 12, 13 years of your life can be formative to that, not just physically, but mentally. Ernst & Young puts out a study every year that I always cite about women in the C-suite, women who are leading Fortune 500 companies and are major executives. And without fail,
athletes.
Overwhelmingly, these women have been athletes at some level in their childhood or in their careers, and it matters. So I think that what we're seeing now, I brought up, Deloitte and some of the investment that we've already seen. We're seeing women who have seen the benefits that they have personally had in their business career from their sports experiences, and they want to pay that forward. And they are now leading companies, and they're coming to lead leagues. And then we're seeing women like Naomi Osaka and Serena Williams and her husband invest in women's soccer teams and in women's teams in general, and actually making real change here. And then we're seeing people like JJ Watt, who wants to buy a women's soccer team as well. I think that we are seeing a huge cultural shift that is frankly backed up by the money. I think that these people have realized, you're not just going to throw a few, tens of millions of dollars at a team because you believe that this is the right thing to do. You believe that this is a smart investment, and you believe that betting on women is a smart bet. And I think that we're going to continue to see that.
That's great. Ada, what do you think is the next step in the fight for women's equality in sports?
Hey, ladies, how am I gonna follow up on that? Kavita and Lindsay, you spelled it out very good. Where to start? I think it all comes down to what we all seek is respect for the work we put down. I think there are so many kick-ass women out there who do an incredible job in their work, and in the end, you want to be respected for who you are, the work you put down, no matter what gender you are, where you're from. And it's all about changing stigmas, I think. The more respect you get in the end, the more investment will follow, I feel. I feel very respected where I play. I'm playing in Lyon, where we basically have a kick-ass president who believed in us from day one. He gave us the financials we needed, the conditions, and over time, he basically got maybe the most winning team in the history. And I mean, you can't only just invest, but you really got to believe in the product you're investing in as well. And that's what you're kind of seeing that in the women's football now in Europe, for example. You see all these big clubs starting women's teams, and it's a very good change. I think with time, all the women who has been pushing for it, leaders who have been pushing for it. But in the end, you also need big clubs to have a plan behind it, to have a project, to invest with a plan, and have a long-term vision. So, I mean, as a player, I try to every day do my best at what I'm doing, work even harder, stay out of the comfort zone in order to elevate the product as well. I want to play a football that attracts the people so that one day they can't outsee us. But obviously we need help with that. And I really like what Kavita said about that. It's about getting leaders at the pitch, taking good decision, pushing federations, pushing clubs, get some pressure on the guys in the leading positions in order to bet more on the women. So we need to push. You see, history repeats itself. You need to push for a change in every theme, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
Fantastic. And Megan, you want to take us home here?
Yeah, I think what everyone said is really important, and especially having it from a player's perspective. When you remove the front offices and the ownerships and the league executives, you have athletes. We continuously see the men and the women support each other. So when you look at that, if you're an investor, if you're in marketing, you should wonder, okay, the women are supporting the men and the men are supporting the women. So they respect each other. They respect what each other is doing on the field or on the court. Why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I? Like that's where I think a lot of the disconnect is also coming from, is look at what the athletes are doing with each other. Look at how they're supporting one another. I mean, this summer we saw a complete, upheaval and uprising of orange hoodies. Whether it was celebrities getting them, but specifically athletes, not just the NBA athletes. There was athletes from football players, hockey players, MLB players, soccer players. They were all supporting the league. And a lot of people this summer thought that the WNBA was going to drop and was going to lose a lot of fans because some big name stars weren't playing because of opting out for whatever reason. And guess what we saw? Some of the biggest numbers in viewership across the board. And we saw that in women's soccer too. So that tells you something. The fans are there. The athletes are there. Ada said it perfectly. We're supporting each other. If that is there, then there's only one step that isn't there. The ownership is there. They're supporting it. The coaches are there. They're supporting it. The leagues need to step up too and support it as well too, because that's where the investment comes from, as Kavita said and explained beautifully when it comes to the numbers. The numbers don't lie. They never have. And they never will. And the numbers are there. So all you have to do is just, as Lindsay said, just take the step.
Yeah.
Take the big swing and make the big bet, and you will not lose on your investment, because the continuous uptick on the women's side in sports is not going anywhere. They're just going to get louder and louder. And that's where you're going to see that you made the wrong choice by not investing.
I love that.
I just want to really quickly just add, it also has to be done in an inclusive way, right? We have to, the leadership, there are no Black women right now owning WNBA teams. There's only one Black woman who's a coach of a WNBA team, right? We're seeing, Black players in WSL feel like they're not being heard, feel like their own teammates are leaving them out of these discussions. So you're seeing these, as we push forward, as more money comes into women's sports, which it will, right? It needs to be intentionally done in a way that includes everyone. Women's sports has this rare chance. It doesn't have to be built the same way that the men's sports were, right? It can eradicate this stuff as it goes if it chooses to, right? But like all change, it has to be intentional. And so, I'm sitting here and wearing the WNBA Say Her Name shirt, which, they dedicated their season to Breonna Taylor. And I just want to, be sure that was stressed too, because I think that gets left out of the conversation far too often.
I mean, I think it's something that we talk about at Barnard, that Barnard is about academic excellence, and academic excellence means having the most diverse viewpoints at the table, pushing each other to think differently. Right. And I think that's true on the athletic field as well. You want different individuals coming from different backgrounds to push as hard as they can, because it makes everyone better. And, I think we have a real moment to do that. So this is such a fantastic panel to have Ade here, who's, we all look up to as a player, and some of our leading journalists who are covering athletics into what is the next phase of sports. And it's just been wonderful and inspiring. I think that's a good way to talk about it, to be around such amazing women. It makes us all a little better at what we do. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.